welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. It's episode number 2 this week. If you missed our first one that dropped on Monday, we had recruiting insider Tyler Calvaruso on with us. He talked a lot about where Penn State stands with some really important targets as they make their way to campus, start to schedule those official visits for later in the spring. A lot of moving pieces. Tyler did a really good job breaking that down. Additionally, in that episode from Monday, we discussed the kind of path to this point for a lot of the spring standouts thus far, guys who are rising up the roster, maybe taking advantage of some opportunities here on the practice field in March and April. Tyler Calvaruso covered all of them as recruits, so we talked a little bit about their trajectory to this point in their college careers. We're going to spin it forward a little bit on this episode. We'll talk about what we witnessed and what we heard from the Penn State practice field on Tuesday afternoon and Tuesday evening. Hopefully you're well informed from our coverage over at Lions247.com since then, but if you missed it, an offensive practice notebook, a defensive practice notebook, video highlights from practice action, a very long photo gallery with photos from both sides of the ball, a video of James Franklin's post-practice press conference, and then Daniel Gallen and I spent a lot of time transcribing, going through those conversations that we had with Penn State players and coaches after practice, and we have all of that over at Lions247.com for our VIP subscribers. You know what to expect on a weekly basis from our practice coverage. We thank you for joining us. If you are not with us on board at the site yet, once again, I'll remind you, through Spring Brawl, 50% off an annual VIP subscription to Lions 24/7. So if you hop on now, it's going to take you into the start of next April. You'll be good to go. Or $1 for 1 month. Get a look at how we cover spring practice, how we're covering a busy time in recruiting, and you're particularly going to watch how we cover the blue-white game in Beaver Stadium on April 26th. A reminder, it is not televised. We will be giving you every detail we can. We'll have our binoculars. There'll be 4 of us represented in Beaver Stadium from Lions247.com. So if you're looking for a time to jump in for VIP coverage, you want to do it there because you won't be watching this event from home unless you're in Beaver Stadium. You're going to be reliant on some reporting. We're going to give you the best reporting we can from the blue-white game. So a couple weeks away from that, we'll break down some things here with Daniel Gallen, takeaways from the practice field, some key feedback regarding Penn State stars, and we also have some position competitions to work our way through. First things first, welcome back, Daniel. Always good to get you back on board.
Thanks for having me today, Tyler.
Of course. I just kind of laid it out. We have a ton of coverage waiting for people at the site if they haven't had a chance to dive into it yet. And we're going to do our best to bring some of those discussions right here onto the podcast like we always do. I thought a good place to start would be our chance to hear from Danny O'Brien. Second year as the quarterbacks coach here for Penn State. He's the guy that's been in James Franklin's orbit going back to his time as a Maryland quarterback. A lot of really high thoughts about what Danny O'Brien can accomplish in his coaching career. And a lot of his early career is going to be judged on 3 seasons spent with Drew Allar, one of which he was assisting Mike Yurcich with quarterbacks. And then the final 2, he'll be the quarterbacks coach for Drew Allar. Daniel, you had a story up on Wednesday morning, late Tuesday night, about O'Brien discussing Drew Allar's development and his progress going toward his senior season. This is a young man who's now approaching his, I think, 30th start as a Nittany Lion all of a sudden, and he's down to his final year of college eligibility. Weren't sure if we'd be around for 2025. He certainly is. So from the good, the bad, and the ugly of putting together Drew Allar to be the best he possibly can be and maybe skyrocket his NFL draft stock, what stood out from that conversation with Danny O'Brien?
Yeah, a lot of the questions in the conversation with Danny O'Brien and Drew Allar centered on, what it's been like since the Orange Bowl, for Drew Allar and Danny O'Brien, just with how that game ended, the type of performance that Allar had, leaving off on such a sour note. I know that we talked about, seeing Drew Allar in the, post-game press conference, just sort of the, disappointment, how down he was, and, what it's been like for him and the rest of the quarterbacks to rebound from that. O'Brien said that they gave it a, week and a half, waited till it wasn't, as raw. And then they went back through the film and then turned the page to 2025. O'Brien said that, losing a game like that is a really humbling experience for a player, especially in that fashion. But he thinks that, not only Allar, but the quarterback room as a whole has a chip on their shoulder coming into the offseason. And that stood out to him. James Franklin was asked a little bit before about, where Allar is, what he needs to improve on. And, he just leaned back to his answer from his first press conference of the spring 2 weeks ago, where he said all of it. And some of the things that he mentioned in there are mobility, leadership, completion percentage, touchdown to interception ratio. But I think it's just clear that they just want to see, holistically, just Aller take that leap overall. And I think O'Brien, offered a little bit of insight there, and the mental approach to things, and how he's working with these quarterbacks right now.
Yeah, last year, as a second-year starter and as a junior, Drew Allar averaged almost 2 more yards per completion on his attempts. He also, as we went through this season, we were discussing his completion percentage. It tailed off in the postseason. He was under 60% in all 4 of those postseason games. But overall, when you compare 2023 to 2024, Mike Yurcich with Andy Kotelnicki as offensive coordinators, he went from 59.9 completion percentage to 66.5 completion percentage as a junior. And Danny O'Brien had more for us on the backup quarterback situation, because that's a battle. We're going to get into that a little bit later with some of our positional competitions. But Daniel, look, I think like every time James Franklin brings us up, he says, no, we need him to take the next step. He's done that since he showed up on campus in January of 2022. James Franklin has never wavered. He's never blinked in his commitment and his belief that Drew Allar is going to fulfill his maximum potential here at the college level. When you hear from Danny O'Brien himself, someone who's intimately involved with Drew Allar on a day-to-day basis, we've already heard from Chuck Losey about some of the physical things they've been working on with Drew in the pocket, out of the pocket. But from a mental standpoint with Danny O'Brien, that's where it seems to be. When anyone talks about Drew, it's about his mental standpoint. They acknowledge he's 6'5". He's 235 pounds. He's an improving athlete. What was your kind of takeaway on maybe anything that Drew Allar needs to clear hurdle-wise here before kickoff?
O'Brien talked about the just sort of an overall mentality of the play's the play, and that he wants them to treat every rep the same, whether that's spring ball, whether that's season opener, in non-conference play, whether it's the Orange Bowl, whether it's a 3rd and goal to win a game. O'Brien just wants to see an overall, I think, consistency in that approach, and not letting a moment get too big. I mean, you talk about it with Aller. Not only did he have the interception in the Orange Bowl, he also had that interception in the Big Ten championship game late, when he was trying to make a play. It's just a couple untimely things, and we know that Drew Aller's in the point of his career when the only thing left to judge him on is how he performs in these big games, how he does against Ohio State, how he does in bowl games, postseason games, whatever it's going to look like next year. And so I think that reading between the lines a little bit maybe with O'Brien is okay, like, let's be ready for these big moments, and make sure that all the preparation that we do from now until fall camp, non-conference play, early Big Ten play, all builds on each other. So you're ready to go, and can play up to your potential in the biggest spots.
We have heard good feedback. We heard it last offseason too, but it would seem more important this offseason with Drew Allar away from coaches, away from a structured practice setting, and making sure guys are getting together, guys are on the same page. And that's important because he's down his top 3 pass targets from last year. And I know Nick Singleton was technically one of his top 3 guys in terms of receptions, but his top 2 receivers production-wise have moved on to other campuses. And then he has a 104 reception tight end who's about to be in the NFL. And so I think a big question here is Drew Allar ready to kind of rise all boats around him? He's a senior quarterback, former 5-star. He's got new weapons, young talent, experienced transfer talent. Can he be the guy that is the catalyst and brings that together? Does he have to depend on that group, or can they depend on him to kind of rise up the entire situation? We'll learn more about Drew. Of course, when he looks behind him or to his side in the backfield, he's got to like what he sees. Fellow seniors in Katron Allen, Nick Singleton, surprised that both of those are back on campus. And let's face it, James Franklin told us in February he was surprised that both of them were on campus still as seniors. That's the case, and we heard from Nick Singleton after practice, had a chance to go chat with him among reporters on Tuesday evening. And I think with Singleton, one thing we were all wondering is this departure from Jaywan Sider and this introduction to Stan Drayton, who's accomplished a lot as a running backs coach across college football. James Franklin on Tuesday said that before he became Temple's head coach, he was considered the best running backs coach in college football. We've talked about his track record a lot. Bijan Robinson at Texas, Ezekiel Elliott at Ohio State, guys he recruited to those campuses, guys that left those campuses at top 10 draft picks. early in his career, Brian Westbrook. So when he recruited to Villanova, Westbrook ends up being in the Eagles Hall of Fame and the College Football Hall of Fame. So he's got a lot to point to, and Nick Singleton certainly respected that when he was discussing Drayton. I think what stood out, though, is he says unequivocally the practice sessions have been more intense under a new position coach. He had Ja'Juan Seider as his running backs coach for 3 years. That's all he knows at the college level. Sounds like, they're sweating a little bit more. Just a little bit more intense energy out there with Stan Drayton. And something that was really stood out from James Franklin's commentary on Nick Singleton's work with Drayton and from Singleton himself is what the focus is for him. It's about improvising in the open field, which I love because we got to see one of the best ever do that here. At least I did my first year covering the team in Saquon Barkley. Nick Singleton, as he builds that repertoire, James Franklin mentioned hurdling. He mentioned making guys miss. Essentially, he talked about avoiding contact with defenders, which Nick Singleton discussed as well. He said, if you can find a way to get past the safety is a touchdown. And so Singleton and Franklin and Drayton, their focus seems to be more on producing those 80, 85, 90-yard sprint runs that can change a game on a dime, that can give you a bunch of juice early in a matchup. And we know that Nick Singleton has those careers. You go back to his freshman season, that first fall at Auburn, kind of came out as a national star on his way to Big Ten Freshman of the Year. But I think last year when he was kind of rumbling through some of those issues from an injury standpoint, you kind of forgot that he could bring that element. He was a reliable pass catcher. He was maybe averaging 4 yards a carry. But this is a guy that, as we saw again in the postseason with him and Kaytron Allen firing on all cylinders, Daniel, if this is truly something he can take another step in as a senior, this could really put him in a different realm as a playmaker, because let's acknowledge it's not just him in the open field after getting the handoff and making some guys miss near scrimmage. It's getting him the ball on screens. It's getting him the ball on patterns down the field, and 50 plus receptions last year. I think if he can duplicate that kind of an impact as a pass target and then maybe enhance that as an open field threat a little bit more, that's something that's really exciting to imagine for Andy Kotelnicki and this entire offense.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to focus on this offseason with Singleton. We've seen what happens when he gets that head of steam. When he can hit the hole and no one's there, or he can get to the edge and run away from guys. But the idea of seeing him in a position where maybe he can have a little bit more wiggle, make some more guys miss in a one-on-one, juke someone out. I think that can definitely add something, to an offense, because, like we've talked about, you have a couple guys on your roster that anytime they touch the ball, it can be a touchdown, and Singleton fits into that category. So if he can, maybe do something to make that more likely to, improve those chances, I think that's really big for Penn State, and, big for Singleton as he tries to maybe round out his game, put some more things on tape, improve that NFL draft stock a little bit going into his senior year.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of sudden movement drills out there with him, but he said two drills in particular that really stood out with Stan Drayton thus far. He said stiff arm drills and vision drills, and look, it's not like they ignored those things the last 3 years with Ja'Juan Seider, but those are things he specifically brought up, and he said that it's interesting because about 10 minutes after James Franklin used a specific phrase, phenomenal, to describe Stan Drayton so far, that's exactly how Nick Singleton described what Stan Drayton has been in that running backs room. Phenomenal. He did discuss his motivation to come back. He said he felt like he would have been fine financially, whether he was going to the NFL or here. For him, he felt like he could come back, compete for a national championship. He was really down in the dumps after that game. I think we saw it in the body language from him. He talked about having to sleep on that, digest that loss, how it ended one game short of the national championship game. He said when he came up for air from that kind of depression phase, all of a sudden he was learning a lot of his class of 2022 guys were going to be back on board. He already knew Drew was back, but Zane Durant, denied Dennis Sutton, and then him and Kaytron Allen got on the same page. He said they gave each other some space to figure out where they wanted to be. And then they said, okay, we're coming. They announced it with each other within a few minutes, I think it was. I wrote one story, you wrote the next, I think, that afternoon. And he says it's just they have felt since freshman year that they are the best backfield, leading the best backfield as a tandem. He said he feels like they really solidified that in their return. And he understands that they are going to be held to a very high standard after what they accomplished in the playoffs. I think their narrative around these guys and the fact that would they even be around both of them if they didn't accomplish what they did in the postseason and it was just more of the same from the regular season. First off, I don't know if Penn State plays as many games as they did into January, But secondarily, we're not having the type of conversation where these two could etch their names atop program leaderboards. I think Nick Singleton needs 866 yards to pass Saquon Barkley for all-purpose yards in a career. That's going to include kickoffs, which he says he's still locked in as a senior. That's going to include receiving yards and rushing yards. And he needs 1,021 yards to become the all-time leading rusher in Penn State history. That belongs to Evan Royster currently. And there's a scenario where if both these guys duplicate their performance from last year, production-wise, it's number one Kaytron Allen or number one Nick Singleton, and then number two Kaytron Allen, number two Nick Singleton. So a lot of exciting stuff there. And I think in terms of defense, when you're talking about who's a guy that could really catapult his draft stock, because if Nick Singleton can go out and be a little bit more of a home run hitter on a consistent basis from game 1 through game 16 or 17, I think all of a sudden he'll be discussed a little bit differently in NFL front offices. And if Zakee Wheatley can build off of an offseason that, once again, we're hearing rave reviews, he is going to be in a serious conversation as a top NFL draft prospect at the safety position. He's a fifth-year safety right now in a room that just lost KJ Winston and Jalen Reed to the NFL draft. A lot riding on him having a big year, being a stabilizing presence. Not only did you hear from Zakee Wheatley on Tuesday after practice, Daniel, but also heard from safeties coach Anthony Poindexter, who's been around this guy's his entire career, essentially, since he made the move from the cornerback room early. So give us the updated progress report on Zakee Wheatley, the fifth-year safety.
Yeah, Zakee Wheatley's in an in an interesting spot where he could have gone to the NFL this offseason. It's something that we kind of thought was a possibility in the back of our minds this year. He was a fourth-year player last year. Now he's going to be a redshirt senior. He played a lot and played really well, especially down the stretch last year. And so he's one of those guys when you talk about, okay, can a nice playoff run, can that catapult someone to the next level? And he played really solidly down the stretch in those games. And so you kind of thought, well, actually, no, he announced before the playoff, but you know what I mean, where he just closed the season in such a, so strong and it looked so good that you looked at him and you thought, okay, this guy could play at the next level. Anthony Poindexter said that, they did talk about the NFL for Wheatley this offseason. But, kind of the question was, is he going to go where he wants to go? Would he get drafted where, he thinks he could get drafted or deserve to be drafted? And he acknowledged that there's some things that Wheatley can improve on, by coming back, and that, he has been building well over these past two off seasons. You go back to last month when we talked to Chuck Losey, and he said that he brought up Wheatley unprompted in his long opening statement, in that list of players, and said that, the last January he'd seen a flip in Wheatley, and Wheatley's work ethic wasn't necessarily a strength earlier in his career, and now it is. And so, asking Poindexter and Wheatley about that on Tuesday night, and they were like, yeah, like we had some conversations after Wheatley's third year, after that 2023 season, where he actually played fewer snaps than he did in 2022. And the big takeaway was that, he had some stuff he needed to work on. And Poindexter said, to his credit, he embraced that, did it immediately, and they saw it right away. So I think that he's someone who, has put himself on an ascending trajectory, through the past year, and now he can build on that and keep that moving forward.
Do you remember last fall, I think it was the Indiana game where he got burnt on a deep ball and never saw the field again? I think it was the first quarter deep ball. And you're just wondering at that point, safety rooms, it's a talented group. Zakee Wheatley is apparently in the doghouse coming out of that matchup. And you were wondering, at least I was, is he going to be able to rebound and really solidify his place as a true talent on the field who's going to be commanding starters reps? And then we heard what he did last offseason. And what did he do? Well, he started his first game and he started his 16 total games. I mean, he played a bunch of ball before that, but never started. He started every single game for a semifinalist at the national level, 96 tackles, 2.5 of those for loss, including a sack. He had 1 forced fumble. He had 3 interceptions. He's a guy that we've always discussed his ability to produce those takeaways. He's been the takeaway king, it feels like, 4 of the last 5 training camps, I think, for Penn State. And with Wheatley now, you think about with King Mack currently being sidelined, we haven't seen him the last couple of weeks. He was wearing some kind of cast on his hand and wrist. Dejan Lane played about 100 snaps or so last year as a freshman, and then everybody else is an unknown commodity in that safety room. So I think when we have these conversations, it's not quite like a Drew Allar where if you take him away, you really don't know what the offense will look like. But this is, to me, one of the more irreplaceable components of the 2025 Penn State defense. And I feel comfortable saying that in part because of what Zachy Wheatley has shown on the field and what we continue to hear about him. But a lot of that has to do with the room that he's working within.
Yeah, Poindexter said that Zachy Wheatley has the chance to be the guy this year, which hasn't necessarily been the case. Poindexter got here in 2021, and he reflected on some of the guys who were already here when he got here and some of the guys that came through. Jaquan Brisker, Jair Brown, Keaton Ellis, Jalen Reed, KJ Winston. All those guys are gone. And it is Zachy Wheatley. He's a redshirt senior. They have 2 non-scholarship fourth-year players. And then in terms of third-year players, you have King Mack, who was gone last year and then came back, and Lamont Payne, who made that switch from corner to safety and who we have not really seen in games. So there's a gulf in experience when you talk about Zachy Wheatley. He played 800, I think it was 882 snaps last year, second most on the defense behind Jalen Reed. He only played 641 combined snaps through the first 3 years of his career. So he's someone who has played a ton of football, and he's really the only guy in that room who has played a ton of football. So you need him back there. Poindexter had a good line where he said Wheatley is kind of like grandpa back there in terms of, that age, that experience, everything that goes along with that. And so he's going to have to be a leader back there. He's going to have to be vocal with that group. It sounds like with the work ethic, he's done a good job of putting himself in a position, to lead by example. So he's an interesting figure for this defense, this year. And, it is like pretty interesting when you think about this lineage of safeties and this kind of, era of Penn State safety play under Poindexter. This is kind of the last guy. It's going to turn over to a new group, and some guys are going to have to step up. But Wheatley seems like the type of guy that can pull guys along with him, especially at this stage in his career.
And this is a guy who looked like power conference capable receiver or defensive back coming out of high school in Maryland. So he is a threat with the ball in his hands. I think maybe the next step is to go out there and pick six something, maybe, because he is that kind of player. He's that kind of presence with the ball in his hands. And we will continue to track Penn State player development practice by practice. We'll have a chance to hear from some of these guys, from coaches, and you can follow all that coverage over at Lions247.com. One more note on Zachy Wheatley, just to hammer home what we've been saying this entire time. No current member of the Penn State roster has handled more combined snaps, I'm talking defense, offense, and special teams, than Zachy Wheatley. 1,924 total snaps under his belt. Next up is Drew Allar, 1,909. And yes, I did the math myself about a week ago, so just trust me on that one. Daniel, when we look towards some of these position battles, look, we got a long way to go. This isn't a complete roster yet. There's going to be summer enrollees. There's another transfer portal window where Penn State could add some experience to position rooms. But at the end of the day, the guys who are out in the field right now and some of the guys who aren't in the field are contributing towards our evolving perception of how this depth chart is going to be in 2025. And we know there's some key spots to fill. A spot that maybe isn't on everybody's mind as much as some of the other areas we're going to look at here coming off the practice field is quarterback 2. And kind of like running back 3, which we're not really going to get into on this episode, it is a short-term conversation where you need someone to be the next man up behind some established stars. And in this case, one star in Drew Allar. And then there's a longer-term conversation where, well, Drew Allar is gone. No matter what happens in January, he's gone. Same deal for Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. So RB3 and QB2, all of a sudden, when we talk about this team getting ready for next year's spring ball, they might be QB1 and RB1. And so with that in mind, again, hearing from quarterbacks coach Danny O'Brien, we've gotten some looks at the other quarterbacks beyond Drew Allar. Where does that conversation stand halfway through spring ball?
James Franklin was asked about that QB2 competition, and he said that they're going to let it ride. They're going to let those guys compete. Jackson Smolik, Ethan Grunkemeyer, kind of sounded like as long as they can. Those are two guys that have not played a lot of football. Smolik has, I think, like 1 or 2 snaps under his belt. Grunkemeyer has a handful from the SMU game. And so these reps are very, very important for them. In the looks of practice that we've gotten, Grunkemeyer looks like he's going through things ahead of Smolik. Like he's working alongside Allar. He'll be the second guy up in a couple different things. When they were
And
split,
Daniel isn't also about who's around them sometimes. Some of who are the receivers and tight ends and running back groupings around them. It's tended to be with Allar and with Grunkemeyer, the primary guys that we expect, and maybe not so much of that variety around Smolik and Beckham Kritza.
Yeah, and there was a drill that we saw on Tuesday night that also showed us the stratification a little bit, where they had the quarterbacks taking snaps and working on things in the backfield, and it was Allar was all by himself. Then you had Smolik and Grunkemeyer together in a second group, and then the last group was Beckham Kritza and Jack Lambert. So we'll see. I think it was interesting where James Franklin said that Smolik isn't as rusty as they thought he would be, coming off of the injury, coming off of so much missed time. We'd heard a lot of good things about him in terms of how he was approaching being injured, his work in the quarterback's room, from the mental side last year when he was sidelined. And so, can he make that translate over? I think that we would agree that Ethan Grunkemeyer is the more physically gifted of those two quarterbacks. But does Smolik, what can the mental side bring him? So it's going to be interesting to follow. One of those things where, in the perfect world for Penn State, you don't need Ethan Grunkemeyer or Jackson Smolik this fall. That everything goes according to plan, and the only time that those guys are in are to do some fourth quarter handoffs in a couple games here and there. But I think right now it's interesting. I think that we're really high on Ethan Grunkemeyer. We've seen him a lot, dating back to camp, dating back to high school, and I think that coming in with his recruiting pedigree, I think we agreed with it. And Smolik, is still a little bit more. He was late onto the scene. He was that flip. He was playing out in Iowa.
Junior season injury, that kept him off the radar.
Yeah, so he's still a little bit more of the unknown commodity. I think to us, at least from our perspective. So it'll be interesting to follow, and I think it's one of those position battles that you can't really underrate as you go through the season.
Where I am at with it now, I was higher on Grunkemeyer coming to campus than I was on Smolik coming to campus in terms of who can be a top-notch Penn State quarterback down the road. Not that I didn't think Jackson Smolik could be that kind of guy, but I was higher on Ethan Grunkemeyer. And now when you kind of factor in the reps that Grunkemeyer was able to get in the practice field last year that Smolik wasn't able to get, even if he was on standby and really engaged like we heard, I tend to give the edge just to Grunkemeyer until proven otherwise. And as you said, that's kind of been the pecking order for practice reps. But James Franklin's going to keep this going deep into the summer, and we'll continue to learn. I will say one thing that we have gotten feedback on is both of those players are preparing like QB1s. There have been some years where you read between the lines or someone outright tells you from within the facility that maybe only one of those guys instead of both of those guys is preparing like QB1. One's preparing like QB3, one's preparing like QB1. That one is going to be your backup. And then you got some questions about where the other kid's head is at. Sounds like both of these guys are invested in winning this job and also trying to take that torch from Drew Allar. There should be no lack of incentive for either of these passers, considering what the NIL landscape does for starting quarterbacks at schools like Penn State right now, beyond the playing experience. You have a lot of financial gains to make if you are the next man up at this spot. Daniel, in terms of protecting the quarterback, Penn State's going to be in a good spot to do that this year. They return 4 of 5 starters. They return other guys who have started games at the power conference level, J.B. Nelson, T.J. Shanahan. And we got face-to-face with Phil Trautwein after practice on Tuesday. I was amazed when I was putting together a story on Wednesday that this is his 6th year. I kind of was stunned by that. I know we said it was amazing how long J1 Sider stuck around. Phil Trautwein has been here for 6 years now, since 2020. And I'm reminded of that 2022 spring ball period where they didn't have enough offensive linemen to have a full team-on-team scrimmage. And we're all wondering, is it ever going to take the next step? Well, by the end of 2022, we knew the offensive line had taken a step forward. And by the end of last year, in that playoff run, they looked like one of the nation's best. And many believe they could be the nation's deepest offensive line. So that maybe complicates things a little bit in terms of what Phil Trautwein's going to be able to do and finding the starting 5, finding the rotations and finding where he wants to put players in different spots, game to game, series by series. And Phil Trautwein said it's a good problem to have. Certainly better than the problem he had a few years ago where he was trying to find 10 offensive linemen practice by practice. The tackle spot on the right side, Daniel, was really interesting last year because we got really strong play, I think, out of Anthony Donko and what we witnessed through his 10 starts. But it may have even been stronger play from Nolan Rucci by the time that his postseason adventure was done. Neither of those guys are currently available. We talked about that last week on the podcast. They're not repping at right tackle. Javen Williams is getting a lot of work there. We've heard from Phil Trautwein. We've heard from James Franklin that pass protection is key for him because he didn't get a lot of that at the high school level with the run-first offense. But what we heard is that Javen Williams, again, from Phil Trautwein, like we heard from James Franklin, they're putting it out there that he's going to get a chance to push those guys. It sounds like from Phil Trautwein that we're not going to see Rucci or Donko engaged again on the field, at least as competitors in pads until training camp. And he says he's not going to hand the job to anybody. Those guys know a competition awaits them like they faced last year. And he says Javen Williams is going to be a part of it. But what I found really interesting here, Daniel, and I think it was really telling of where Phil Trautwein's mind is about this whole room and where our mind should be, he said Anthony Donko and Nolan Rucci could play guard for him. He said don't exclude them from the conversation at guard. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But just the fact that we've got those two guys that we're so focused on who's going to win that right tackle job. And Phil Trautwein is saying, hey, there's multiple spots those guys could land. We still like Javen Williams. To me, this position where it is right now and the way Phil Trautwein's talking about all three of those players, that essentially encapsulates where we're at in the offensive line discussion overall.
Yeah, it's really intriguing when you look at all of the names that Penn State has, how they're going to try to get all those guys time, how they're going to get them onto the field. And, my first reaction when, seeing that the mention of Donka and Rucci playing guard, it was kind of like, yeah, you got to figure out how to get your best five out there. And then you might have to try something new, try something different to make that happen. I'm someone good problem to have. I believe all problems are problems. So, you're going to have to make some difficult decisions. There's probably going to be some hurt feelings one way or another, but I think that this is where it really comes through, your ability to coach as a communicator, to get guys to see things, to, get through to 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds about these situations. But yeah, I mean, I think that when you talk about all these names and they only lose one starter from the line last year with Sal Wormley, and you're thinking about working in like 3 or 4 new guys, and so like I don't see Nick Dawkins coming off the field at all. Hard for me to see Vanga Ioane come off the field at all, even though he does have the flexibility to play both right and left, which we saw last year. When they got JB Nelson on the field at left guard. So that helps a little bit. And it's also hard to see Drew Shelton coming off the field too. So there's a lot of, different things that Phil Trautwein is working through and trying to figure out, what this is going to look like. And, I think that we talk about the challenges that they had in 2021 and, in that spring. This is a different type of challenge, but it's another one of those things that is going to be it's another test for a coach, and it's another opportunity, for Phil Trautwein to show the type of coach that he is. And so I think it's going to be fun, going through the different combinations, seeing guys work. It's going to be really entertaining to track those different combinations during the blue-white game. But it's going to come down to how does Phil Trautwein think these pieces deserve to fit together, and how is he going to communicate that and try to keep some of these guys happy.
Those 3 guys you mentioned, and when did they come off the field? Drew Shelton at left tackle, Vanga Ioane started at left guard last year. We've seen him at right guard this spring. He can play both. He can also play center. But Nick Dawkins and Ioane on the inside, and then him on Shelton on the perimeter, those guys were all over 90% snap shares last season. That's including blowout games that they got to step out of. So they were rarely off the field. Sal Wormley was the one starter last year. And again, Rucci and Donko were kind of in their own category. He was the one full-time starter last year where it was kind of by design that he was getting kind of chipped down some of his work. He was at like 77% snap share. You saw JB Nelson involved. You saw Cooper Cousins involved at that guard spot. And so that's where we are now. The left guard spot, we'll focus there because it seems like Venga is moving forward at right guard. Phil Trautwein says there's a few different reasons for motivation there. One, he knows he can play left guard at an elite level. He now wants to get him a lot of experience at the right guard. He says it's going to help this team, and he says it's going to help Venga Ioane when it comes time to talk to NFL coaches and evaluators when he chooses to make that jump to the pros. But when you talk about JB Nelson and Cooper Cousins and TJ Shanahan, who's going to have their feelings hurt? Who's going to be standing on the sidelines watching a lot of football, maybe scratching their head and trying to be patient as they can? TJ Shanahan is a former top 24/7 recruit. He started 5 games for Texas A&M at guard last season as a redshirt freshman. The offensive line coach who brought him into Texas A&M, Steve Adazio, is a mentor to Phil Trautwein. Trautwein worked under him at Boston College. They have a great relationship. Adazio was not the offensive line coach at Texas A&M last year, but they had that shared rapport. Essentially got the sign off on this kid, and Adazio signed off on Trautwein, and that helped make this work for bringing him up to campus. And now you discuss where he's at. I mean, they love everything about him, but how is he getting on the field? We've seen him as the second right guard behind Venga Ioane, and Venga Ioane is an early preseason All-American pick by ESPN. And on the left side, it's been JB Nelson, it's been Cooper Cousins. We've seen each of them getting work with the ones. Fortunately, Phil Trautwein was kind enough to tell us that JB Nelson's been getting more work with the most work with the ones at this point. He said he's been primarily working with the ones, but also with the twos. And Nelson started 8 games at left guard in 2023 before Venga Ioane took that job over late when Nelson was sidelined by an injury. And Cooper Cousins, everyone thinks he can be the next big thing, or he already is the next big thing for Penn State football. Nick Dawkins told us he can be the face of this program. Phil Trautwein said he's just a couple steps away from being an elite player. And he played as much for a freshman offensive lineman last year as we had seen in about 5 or 6 years for Penn State football. So that leads me to say, Daniel, the transfer portal is going to open in a couple of weeks. And I think that when we look at that, it's going to open before the Blue-White game. I think you just have to consider some of those younger pieces. I know Phil Trautwein really talked about this on Tuesday, the fact they haven't had a lot of portal exits over his career and how they have a lot of trust and buy-in because of guys leaving and going to become NFL draft picks. And people are kind of willing to take and wait their turn. But there is a collection of players here where you just wonder if they get to the final stages of spring ball. They haven't maybe accrued as many reps as they had hoped with the first or second team role, and maybe they're trying to figure out what it's going to look like in August. Phil Trautwein is going to have to kind of massage the situation, I'd imagine, have some heart-to-heart conversations, because that's the nature of college football. Chim Diono, Alex Birchmeyer, Donnie Harbor, these are former 5-star recruits who are in their second or third years here playing ball, and right now it's hard not to qualify them as third stringers at the guard spot, or
former
maybe
top
beyond.
247 recruits.
Yeah, former top 24/7 recruits, big time talents there. So I think when we evaluate that group, this is a big test for Phil Trautwein, finding the right combination of players to fill the right tackle spot, to fill the left guard spot, but also trying to solidify and be able to grow those roots with some of these third string players who next year could be at the top of the conversation.
Yeah, this is the nature of the beast, especially even more so in the transfer portal era, in terms of, if, guys waiting for their turn, figuring out that patience. But it also shows the type of program that Penn State runs. I think, I forget which coach it was that we talked to last week, where, he said that his job is to bring the best players in and then bring players in that are even better than them. And then it's up for the players who are already here to, win those jobs, to have that competition. And, James Franklin talks about it all the time, like the most competitive environment in college football or college sports or whatever. That's what Penn State fosters. And, this is what it is. And it also is a example of just how this works. Like, not everyone is a hit. Developments take different time. Things click, in different situations. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. And I think that when you talk about the overall health of the program for Penn State, when you consider where they were a couple of years ago, this is good. If there is attrition, if there is turnover, it's just the nature of the beast. And it's because you have guys that are entrenched, that you have developed high-level starters and things of that nature. So we'll see. It's going to be interesting for sure. But I think that right now Phil Trautwein's at the point where he has the benefit of the doubt. for that room and how everything goes.
From an obvious liability to an obvious strength in the offensive line room during his tenure. And just to pass along a few more notes, we have a full breakdown of Phil Trautwein reviewing his room and some guys on the rise there. Had some really good things to say about the younger tackles, redshirt freshman Egan Boyer and Garrett Sexton, and also had some really, really early praise for Owen Alcine, the freshman who should be still in high school but enrolled during the winter, has a hockey background, a really interesting prospect there. So continuing to stockpile young talent beyond these position competitions that we're focusing in on in 2025. Across the trenches, defensive tackle is an area where you lose a bunch of veterans. You lose a 2-year starter in Devon J. Thomas. Keziah Izzard played a ton of football for you. Akeem Beamon played a ton of football for you. Alonzo Ford has played a lot of college football, but he suffered an injury last November. He's not yet full go on the practice field, but we got a good indication from James Franklin on Tuesday that Ford is very much factoring in. We did see him in a light blue jersey earlier this month. That indicates that he is active but limited on the practice field. And so with Alonzo Ford, James Franklin says they feel really good about 3 guys right now at the defensive tackle spot. Zane Durant, no doubt about that. He's considered one of the premier players at his position as a senior. He also mentioned the third man, Xavier Gilliam, redshirt freshman, a guy who was kind of waiting in the wings last year if he needed to be called upon, particularly during that postseason run. Did not need to really happen for him, but he is ready, willing, and able to step up right now. And James Franklin says it's really going to come down to a battle for those 4th and 5th spots, and maybe even a 6th if they get to that kind of a rotation. I'll tell you what, when we saw the defensive tackle work, at least I was watching it on Tuesday, they were split into 2 groups. One, I felt pretty confident in saying this is the primary defensive tackle group. Beyond the 3 guys I just mentioned in Zane Durant, or actually we didn't see Alonzo Ford. Again, remember, he's not out there for a lot of what we're watching, but Zane Durant and Xavier Gilliam were there. So were Ty Blanding, a redshirt sophomore. So was redshirt freshman DeAndre Cook. And so is true freshman Randy Adarica, who seems to be a bit of a wild card here because we had some really good feedback from him, from James Franklin on Tuesday. And so when you kind of piece all that together, a couple of things there. Confirms that Alonzo Ford isn't a long-term risk here because of his injury recovery. That's big news for Penn State. And then the second is that Xavier Gilliam is precisely where we thought he might be. It really entrenching himself as a top of the rotation defensive tackle talent in year 2 on campus.
Yeah, the way that this shakes out is I think this is going to be another fun position battle when you think about the different combinations, especially because Penn State has put together guys with different body types. Like Zane Durant is very unique in his own way. Ty Blanding is similar to him. Alonzo Ford is unique in his own way. Xavier Gilliam is his own guy. Like you can really mix and match for different situations and have guys who can do different things out there. The Randy Adarica buzz is interesting because, like we've talked about that, when you're playing in the trenches, coming in as a true freshman, even if you enroll early, it can be difficult. That can be a heavy lift, a heavy ask. I feel like that's why you see a lot of these defensive tackles, a lot of offensive linemen, they take that redshirt year first. I think Zane Durant was unique in his own case that he was able to come in and contribute right away. And so we'll see with Randy Adarica. James Franklin called him a pleasant surprise. Zane Durant had some good things to say about him when we talked to Durant last week. And so I put Adarica in that let's monitor him category. There's a big learning curve coming in from high school and joining a college program and everything that comes in with it. So we'll see. But I think DeAndre Cook and Ty Blanding are 2 guys that I'd really like to see more of. Blanding has that body type that's similar to Durant, more of that compact, big lower body. I don't think anyone probably has the same twitch as Zane Durant, but you would hope that Ty Blanding can do something similar. And then DeAndre Cook is someone who had the chance to develop last year. When we talked to him in February, he was another guy who sounded like he knew there was an opportunity ahead of him that he needed to take advantage of. I think that this is definitely a thing where Penn State is, I feel like there's non-conference games where we could see them roll through a ton of guys in September and, seeing what Wayful can do, what Joseph Mpoye can do, what Liam Andrews can do. Get these guys on the field, get some tape, go from there. But you're going to need it's a long season. I think Penn State was fortunate when Hakeem Beamon left the program and they started really leaning on that top 3. And then when Ford got hurt, they were they were one injury away in the postseason from being in a really tough spot. So over 17, 16, 15, however many games it's going to be, you're going to need some combination of a lot of different guys to be able to contribute at different spots. And that starts right now, figuring out what these guys can do, what kind of combinations work, who's on the rise, and then going from there.
Strictly talking starting lineup, who they're going to send out there against Nevada for the first defensive series. Zane Durant's no doubt about it. It sounds like Alonzo Ford and Xavier Gilliam have some competing to do, but I don't know that it really matters which of those is the first out. I think when it all shakes out in terms of the total snaps at the end of the season, I'd expect there to be not much of a difference among that three as things go. Zane Durant obviously pacing the way. So we'll keep tabs on that group. I'm glad you brought up Liam Andrews, a former top 24/7 recruit, one of their top-rated recruits last year. He was sidelined all season. He's getting his feet back underneath him on the practice field this spring. And then I'm also glad that you brought up now I forget who you brought up, but another defensive lineman. Owen Wafel. Yeah, Wafel's a guy that's very intriguing to me because he was a pretty impressive dude at the high school level in Princeton, New Jersey. His brother's now a big time recruit, but he didn't do anything on the field that we can be aware of at Michigan. So it's kind of like a lost year in terms of where is he developmentally. So to hear James Franklin go out of his way and say he's doing some good things, that's also good. More compelling pieces to track there beyond the top competitors at defensive tackle. Over at linebacker, it's another area where it's not a complete process yet. Just like you're missing Alonzo Ford from the conversation there, you're missing Tony Rojas from the practice field right now. We addressed that going into the spring. There also have been without Dakari Nelson, who made a move from safety to linebacker last year. But I'll tell you what, we knew Dominic DeLuca would be toward the front of that line, but in front of the line at every single drill ahead of DeLuca last practice was Tamir Robinson. And he's somebody that the last few weeks, just watching him on the practice field, hearing from some staff members here as well, the confidence has really skyrocketed. Kobe King spoke very highly of him at Pro Day in terms of his ability to maybe step into that Mike role if that's where he ends up. And so I think we've talked about him a bunch. I'm not going to harp on it, but it's becoming obvious that he has a job to go hunt down right now. And it's kind of his to lose, I would almost say. I don't know how often we're going to see three linebacker sets. It's going to be a 4-2-5 base defense for Penn State. We'll get to that fifth defensive back in a moment. But it seems like the top three linebackers right now, when you're just kind of penciling it in, would be Rojas, DeLuca, Tamir Robinson. And then very curious, kind of right on the edge of that, right on the fringe, is redshirt freshman Anthony Specca. He's been toward the front of those lines. He's always looked very athletically smooth in these drills. He's now bigger, more physically developed. He came to campus pretty ready to roll last year from a mental and physical standpoint. I would say kind of like Gilliam, maybe not to that point because there was more depth at defensive tackle, but a guy that the staff expressed confidence in burning redshirt last season, and they never really got to that point where they did it. So here in year two, he's definitely a guy to monitor, and as is Keon Wiley, again, trying to reacclimate himself after spending a season away from live action. But Daniel, this linebacker room, I think where I'm at on it right now is I really like the prospect profiles and kind of the career trajectories, even if they aren't proven, of like the top 5 or 6 guys here. I'm not putting LeVar Arrington in that conversation right now. I know people want to thrust him into it. Let's give him some time to develop. He's an elite athlete. He's a lot of fun to watch out there, but let's give him some time. Maybe talk about him next year when we're discussing primary roles on the defense. But Daniel, the top 5 or 6 guys here, I can kind of work with that. And as much as I love Kobe King, I can see it getting to a point where if these guys can get experience under their belt in September and October, that we feel better about this 2025 linebacker unit going into November than we felt about the 2024 linebacker unit really at any point last year.
Yeah, it's a group that you feel good about, like you said, from the prospect profiles and what guys have done, what we think that they still can do. But it's a lot of unproven guys.
Mm-hmm.
You look at it, and it's pretty much DeLuca and Rojas are the guys who have played the most meaningful reps. They might be, I have their roster up right now. I mean, they might be the only guys who have played meaningful reps. I know Dakari Nelson played a little. He started in that Illinois game, saw a little bit of time.
He didn't play, but Dakari Nelson was like a complete non-factor for like most of Big Ten play and postseason play on defense. He was a special teams factor, and so was Tamir Robinson. We just never saw Penn State utilize their backup linebackers at any kind of like rate that would lead us to see these guys develop or lead us to say, yeah, he's figured it out, because we're just not getting that kind of sample size. And so, like you're saying, we're kind of forecasting here. Maybe some people are wish casting, and I don't know if it's going to look awesome at the start of the season or even if it's going to look awesome by the time they get to that Oregon game. But in my mind, again, I think when you talk about long-term goals for Penn State, if you can feel like you're buttoned up and you got 5 or 6 guys ready to roll come November, that's a big step because last year it felt like they only really were comfortable playing 3 guys, and one of them was wearing a cast for most of the season.
Yeah, and I think with Robinson, the interesting sliding doors thing is what happens if he doesn't get hurt in that season opener at West Virginia. That cost him some time. Those valuable non-conference reps. Maybe things would have looked a little bit different for him. But yeah, I think that it's the injury stuff with Robinson is interesting, and what it might look like if that hadn't happened, where he might be. But yeah, I mean, he's someone that when you imagine things, 6'3", 231 pounds. He played safety in high school. I think he also played defensive end. He was a very do-it-all defender. And you think about putting that in the middle of a defense and what that might look like, and what kind of problems that can cause for an opposing offense. And it's exciting. But especially at linebacker, you can have all the athletic traits, but you got to be able to process. You got to be able to have these instincts. And I think that's really the big unknown for us from our perspective. We can hear things and we can look at things in practice, but until we're seeing these guys on Saturdays in the fall, reacting, reading, trying to make the right play, we really don't know. So I agree with you. Prospect profiles, the recruiting that Penn State's done, some of the flashes that we've seen from guys like Keon Wiley in their limited time. I think that there's upside, reason for excitement. But it's still very unproven. And, Dan Connor, I think that we like him, like his upside as a coach and a developer. We've heard good things. And so how can you get these guys ready to play?
Yeah, they're learning from a former All-American Nittany Lion linebacker, so that's a good place to start. And we're going to finish with some defensive back commentary here because there's a few things to get into there. At cornerback, it's a very established who the top 3 are. It's A.J. Harris, who transferred in from Georgia and started 15 games last year. It's Davian Collins, who transferred from Mississippi State in 2023, really stepped up and played well during the postseason last year. And then it's junior Elliott Washington, who's been an absolute beast during the offseason this year. We've covered that quite a bit. He has continued his trajectory in spring practices. Got a bit of a look at who might be in play beyond that 3. The first 2 up that we saw at practice on the perimeter were Darius Dixon, the highly lauded freshman from Mater Dei High School in Southern California, who enrolled during the winter, a guy that we have heard is day one ready. And certainly his ascension maybe as a top 5 or 6 cornerback is going to reflect that. And then Kenny Wosley was the other playing opposite of Dixon. He's a redshirt freshman, came to campus last summer out of Philly. This is his first experience with spring ball, but we have heard some really good things about his IQ, his ability to play various cornerback positions. So something to monitor there. And then at safety, again, we're looking beyond King Mack right now because we haven't seen him on the field the last couple of weeks. Over at Pro Day a few weeks ago, he was wearing a cast on his hand wrist area. So we'll track on that. If he's back, hopefully we get a chance to see him. But with him out of sight, out of mind for this conversation, you've got Dejan Lane, I'll pronounce it correctly, was the first man up alongside Zakee Wheatley. No surprise there. The next 2 up, though, and that's kind of the question we all had. Who are the guys that maybe in that pecking order? It was Vabu Torre and it was Antoine Belgrave-Shorter, both of them redshirt freshmen. Belgrave-Shorter is a guy who moved from the cornerback position during his freshman year. And then Vabu Torre is someone who, to me, maybe outside of Zakee Wheatley because he's just so long and he's got this wingspan, but he is one of the more physically impressive defensive backs that they have on this team in Vabu Torre. He is someone who makes the case as the most physically imposing player out there. He's not the longest, but he's also someone that has really been able to dish out jarring hits at the high school level. I think we saw it last year in the blue-white game when he got some extended looks. So I'm very intrigued by that physical nature of his game. And I'll just finish it out here, Daniel, in terms of defensive backs and throw it to you for whatever you want to add to this, because you've seen some defensive back work at practice. That 5th spot, it's going to be a 4-2-5. So whoever's in that 5th spot, they're going to see a lot of action. We've typically focused in on Zion Tracy and King Mack for that role because Tracy finished out last year playing well in it. King Mack has experience in the slot. He has experience as a versatile defensive back. But right now, neither of them are on the practice field. The last couple of weeks, no Tracy, no Mack. We did see Colin Dinkins play that role. He was in that Lion spot a little bit last year on the practice field, did some decent things. This is Khalil Dinkins' younger brother. He's a redshirt junior. He looks as a safety or cornerback, Daniel. I know we had a change.
He's a safety now.
He's a safety now. And so he's in that fifth role. The other guy we saw there, John Mitchell, another one of those redshirt freshman cornerbacks, came up from Florida, same high school as Antoine Belgrave Shorter. So both of those guys maybe making some inroads. I got to throw in the caveat that when King Mack and Zion Tracy are available, I still think they're ahead in the pecking order. But a pretty decent picture that we got to paint coming off the practice field about where some of these competitive conversations might be landing halfway through spring ball.
Yeah, I think I view that the biggest competition in the secondary right now as that fifth spot. I think that at cornerback, I think Terry Smith laid it out pretty well last year that it's AJ Harris, Elliot
Collins
Washington, and Davian Collins.
Yeah.
Like those three, that's set. Safety, we know it's going to be Zachy Wheatley, and I think that we feel good about Dejon Lane taking a step, building off last year and getting to do spring ball for the first time and being ready. But in that fifth spot, I think that it's Zion Tracy or King Mack. I think that is probably what it's going to come down to. I thought that Zion Tracy did really well in that nickel role last year. After KJ Winston went down, they shuffled it a little bit more, moved Jalen Reed back to safety, and Tracy was on a lot as that 50B and a more traditional nickel corner spot. And I liked what he was able to do. And then King Mack is someone that I think KJ Winston at Pro Day said that he's someone to watch for that fifth defensive back. I think last year when KJ Winston went down, we were all like, wow, it'd be really nice to have King Mack right now to be out there. So I think that's sort of where you start there. Colin Dinkins is really impressive physically, and I think that he did some really nice things in the blue-white game last year, but that didn't really carry over to the fall. So can he make that happen? Is that a possibility? I think that's something to keep in the back of your mind. And
former walk-on, by the way. I should mention that his brother was a scholarship player. His brother was a 4-star. His brother is probably going to be the number 1 tight end for Penn State this year, or 1A, 1B. But his brother was a walk-on, so he encountered a different path here at Penn State. Now, so good on him for at least being a guy that we continue to discuss, because a lot of walk-ons don't work their way into the conversation on the podcast. Definitely.
And then with Mitchell, I think that for someone who is that young and is in such a deep room, you're kind of looking, what's the pathway up to a spot. And I think that last year when we saw him in games a little bit, it was primarily on the outside. So this is something new, and maybe this is an opportunity that's opening up for him. With some of these guys sidelined, he can get a little bit more reps, maybe accelerate development there a little bit. But I think in the secondary, I just think that biggest competition to monitor is going to be, does that fifth defensive back come from safety room or the corner room? And then, I think that then we'll see once we get in the games what that actually looks like. I don't necessarily think it'll be, the exact same thing that we saw Jalen Reed doing at West Virginia in the season opener, but I think you have to have a unique skill set to play there. And I think Tracy and Mack fit that bill right now.
Yeah, and I'll just say on Mack, if he's around last year and he sticks it through after spring ball, he could be that first guy up in the line role when they get out there instead of Cam Miller and then ultimately Zion Tracy. That could have been his job over the course of 2024. He went to Alabama for a year, came back here, a bit of a reset. We'll see where he is as a junior, but a lot to monitor there. And I'm very curious, can Darius Dixon, in the next 4.5 months or so, 5 months, can he show that now he might be your cornerback 4 as a freshman? That's not an easy thing to accomplish in this room, but I'd imagine he is giving some of those redshirt freshmen runs for their money on the practice field right now. Daniel, fun kind of breaking down a lot of these different competitive areas. There's a lot more on the field that we have to keep watching. We'll be back at practice again next week. We'll be back on the podcast as well. Something we'll be monitoring in the coming days, starting tonight, is also Penn State's hockey program. We're going to close out with a quick note on that because they have reached the Frozen Four. They are 1 win away from getting to the national championship game on Saturday. But first things first, they have a matchup as we record here on Thursday, about 8 hours from now. Daniel has a couple stories over at Lions247.com as we put the spotlight on the men's hockey squad for a bit here. And Daniel, just generally, if people are going to tune in tonight, maybe they haven't experienced the whole ride, they're just hopping on the bandwagon at the perfect time. What do they need to know about Penn State hockey's journey?
Well, you're going to be watching a team that has really been through it this year. They started 0-9 in Big Ten play. That stretches into, I think, early January. They lost in a shootout to Notre Dame at Wrigley Field, and that dropped them to 0-9. And it was looking like a lost season. Since then, though, they've been one of the hottest teams in the country. They went on this run where they had separate winning streaks of 6 and 7 games, really, burst back onto the Big Ten scene, burst back onto the national scene, got into the tournament where I believe they were the lowest seed in the Allentown Regional. And then they emerge and they are going to St. Louis for the Frozen Four. They'll play Boston University Thursday night at 8:30 on ESPN2. And you've got a pretty good contrast here. Boston University, this is their third straight Frozen Four, 25th overall. They're going for a 6th national title. Then you got Penn State, which has only been a varsity program since, I believe, 2011. This is their first Frozen Four. Obviously, they've never won a national championship. And then there's also a similar contrast on the other side of the bracket where Western Michigan is a first-timer, and then Denver is a school that this is familiar territory for them too. So some interesting dynamics there. I think that the Penn State hockey story has been well-trod. Terry Pagula's impact, building the facility, building up the program, not only building up the Penn State program, but hockey in the area. Guy Godowski was kind of like, he talked about how when he first got here, his sons were playing on the lowest division team and they were the worst one in the team. Now, Penn State local hockey or State College local hockey, they're winning the highest division. So there's just been kind of the impact on the community has been really interesting to see. And then, this team, the way that they play, what they've been through, what they're working towards is a really compelling story. So we've got a couple things on Lions 24/7. I'll be watching the game tonight and writing off of it. If you're in the State College area and you haven't made plans, it sounds like a lot of different places are doing watch parties, including at Pagula. So you got a lot of options to experience something brand new for Penn State. This Penn State athletic department's been around for a long time. There's not a whole lot of room left for firsts for the Penn State Nittany Lions overall. But this is, I think, a pretty unique one and a pretty fun one.
And this is something that James Franklin actually led off of his post-practice commentary with on Tuesday, was pointing out the hockey program success and then pointing out Pat Kraft's success and what he's been able to do as athletic director. This would be the third national championship if they're able to win 2 more, matching women's volleyball and then also the wrestling program, which wins every year, it seems. So it really impressive. And by the way, you tack that on top of your first trip to the college football playoff and bringing in Jim Knowles. There's a lot of things stacking up in Pat Kraft's favor these days, and he's got a nice contract extension that's well paying him. That kind of proves that as well. Daniel, appreciate it. We'll see if the hockey gives us more reason to cover it into Saturday and the national championship game. If that's the case, we'll provide that coverage over at Lions247.com. Of course, we have a ton coming your way from spring football, from recruiting. There's more recruits on campus this Thursday. There's more recruits on campus Saturday for practice. Tyler Cavaruso has a ton of updates today and through into the weekend over at Lions247.com. 50% off an annual deal, $1 for 1 month. Daniel, always a pleasure. We'll talk to the folks soon. We'll talk to you soon as well.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right, for now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.